I got a bunch of frames really cheap from the thrift store, so I thought I would make a diorama to fit inside them. This is one of the frames. I used 6mm MDF to just make the box inside the frame a little bit bigger. Then I come through with some 3D models I printed to find out where I want them to sit. I want to put a little plaque or title underneath the diorama, so I don't want it sitting directly on the ground. So I come in with some inch foam, just all scraps. These are all scrap pieces of foam, just to build the basic structure that will then go over with some homemade sculptor mold. So the idea of this diorama is that there's a cave, this dark, deep cave that a bunch of skeletons are coming out of. And on the other side, we have our big bear and our little kid fighting against this horde of skeletons. I'm using a mixture of hot glue, PVA glue, and a couple of toothpicks to hold this whole structure together. It doesn't need to set instantly, it just needs to be tacky enough that you can put on the sculptor mold, because that'll be the thing holding this entire piece together. And I'll show you how I make it for pennies on the dime just a little bit further in. A lot of this project is waiting for things to dry. So if you're crunched on time, it's really good to have everything ready so you can paint miniatures while you're waiting for the rest of the model to dry. And again, coming in with another dry fit to kind of see where I want everything to go. So I wanted to have rocks and rock faces, but I don't have any rock molds. So I made my own using aluminium foil. I layered 4 layers of aluminium foil, putting PVA glue in between each one, and that gave me a layer that I could work with and mold into my own mold. Now this takes ages to dry, but once you have some, you can reuse it for a bit. This is a pretty old technique. You just cut a piece off, crinkle it up, and then into that you can pour your plaster. Make sure to sit it in some sand or something like that, because the bottom of the mold won't hold its shape by itself. And I go through and I end up making a lot more than I need. Now to take it out, you just peel the aluminium foil back. Some of it might get stuck on, but then you can reuse that aluminium foil and you got a pretty nice looking rock face. So I just come in with the pieces that I got and try to figure out and mark out how I want them to sit in the model. And I use hot glue, a mixed PVA as well, to hold that all in place. And of course, we'll come through later with the homemade sculptor mold to really solidify all of that in the proper place. You can see the big bear's already painted. I'm just making sure that he'll fit standing on top of this rock. Now on that little rock face, I marked out the door and just carve it out using a little saw. I end up just breaking it up quite a bit and having to stick it all together. And then really should have used hot glue here, or something that would have set a bit faster. 5-minute epoxy would have worked really well. I just didn't have any on hand. Okay, time for the homemade sculptor mold. This is a pretty old recipe. You just water down plaster of Paris a little bit more than you normally would, and then dump in a bunch of toilet tissue that you've ripped up. And that gives the nice consistency of cottage pie like sculptor mold. And you can really work that around and make your ground covering, and it locks everything in place, makes it really tough, and gives a nice texture on the ground. I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty, but if you're a bit more cleanly, you put on a pair of gloves and it'll work just fine. And you can just work it in with your fingers and wet down your fingers to smooth it off at the end. One key thing though is not to get any of this on those rock faces. You want it to bind the rock faces in and hold them tight, but you don't want to cover it with the sculptor mold because that'll ruin all that nice detail. So you leave that to dry. I come through, sand it off. I cut off any pieces that'll be sticking out and just use a little metal scraper to get rid of any pieces on the back wall that may have dried there. And then I give the whole thing a nice coat of black Mod Podge. Then I come in with some greys and browns and some white for the sky, just to serve as a foundation for all of the flock and the painting we'll do later on. And with the dry brush return, those rocks really come alive. Because this diorama is not going to have any lights or anything, I need to come in with some really bright colors. So I'm using cobalt hue blue, and I'm fading that from white down the bottom all the way to the bright blue at the top. This old brush covers a lot of surface area, but it leaves streaking marks quite a lot. So I come in with some dry brushes, and it ruins it, but it's an old cheap makeup brush anyway. And you really see how it's gotten rid of all of those brush marks to leave a nice smooth gradient. Now that that's all dry, and I mean bone dry, we can now come in with the black brown wash, homemade mix of just black paint, brown paint, a little bit of green, and that will give that third dimension to those rocks. But always being very careful not to get any on that beautiful sky we just painted. And now this is where it all really comes to life, the flocking. First I'm going to start off with some dirt flock, using some real dirt, some sand that I painted brown, and some burnt tea leaves. Just absolutely covering anything that would be dirt. Basically everything except for the rocks. And then after all of that is dry, we come in with another layer of flock. Using some watered down PVA glue, I haphazardly plant it all over. I don't do 100% coverage on this one, because this will just be where the grass is growing. And the grass is a mixture of light green, dark green, and yellow flock. And the flock I make is just using sawdust that has been drenched in paint. And that is looking really bright and really great as a backdrop. I come in and get rid of any excess that might have landed anywhere, clean that up, and then I come in with some tiny little scale trees that'll really add like a perspective. I've got one large one that's a bit closer and one real small one that I've cut in half and glued against the back wall. Now to hide those unsightly seams between the ground and the sky, I've come in with some really nice clump foliage and glued that all along the edge. That can be bushes, it can be faraway forests, it's wherever really your mind takes you, but it's mainly just a backdrop for these miniatures. And then finally coming in with some super glue and placing all of these little miniatures. I'm not quite sure, I can't remember where I got these. I tend to just save miniatures from Patreon and just put them in a big folder so they all get unsorted. But these all look really great, even though I'm pretty sure they're not from the same set. And I printed Together for Always and Forever. This little kid and this big bear taking on all of the horrors in the world together. Forever. Thanks for watching this long. Please remember to like and subscribe if you want to see more.